Good evening. My name is Richard Curtis, and I'll be your host this evening for Hemispheres. This evening, we are honored to have with us by phone 2nd Congressional District Representative David Skaggs. And David, are you with us?
I am, Richard. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us.
Glad to do it, and I wish I could be in the studio with you. I'm down in my office in Westminster.
Probably a little hampered by the weather.
A little bit. I gather we've gotten a lot more snow at home in Boulder.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. It's stopped up here for now, so travel's getting a little bit easier, but it's pretty icy when you head home.
I'll be careful.
Okay. We did want to let listeners know that we're going to be taking calls a little bit later in the show, but I wanted to start things out by just asking a few questions myself. And I think the big thing that's on everyone's mind these days is probably the fast-track legislation. So, David, I understand from news accounts and actually a press release from your office that you are intending to support the fast-track legislation.
Well, I did intend to support it. Whether we will ever get to a vote on it is now very uncertain. I announced my intention to vote for it back fairly early in September. But as you probably know, the bill was pulled early Monday morning after a long marathon end of session of the House that started Sunday afternoon and went on and on and on and on as both Gingrich among the Republicans and the President among the Democrats were looking for enough votes to pass the bill. And having come up short, it was not brought to the floor ultimately for a vote. It is uncertain whether they will decide that it is worth bringing it up again later next year or not. I wouldn't bet on it.
Well, now, this is, controversial legislation, to say the least. Why is it that you decided to support it, at least in principle?
Well, several different reasons. First of all, in my opinion, and you are right to call it controversial, so I recognize other people have different views on this. In my opinion, it is a good thing for us to expand our access to markets in other countries, which was the objective of this. It's a good thing for Colorado, where we have more and more of our jobs and our job growth dependent upon the export part of this economy. I also believe that it is important for the United States to remain in a leadership role in international trade and international affairs generally, and that there are significant implications if we retire from that position by not authorizing this president to continue to have the kind of authority to negotiate trade deals that other presidents for a long, long time have had before him, that will invariably, inevitably be seen by both our friends and our economic and security competitors in the world as, to some degree, a backing away from leadership responsibilities by the United States that they will seek to take advantage of.
Well, now certainly the things that you're saying all sound pretty good, but I get the sense that a lot of people are not convinced that the job issue in particular really plays out, especially given the experience with NAFTA.
Well, I understand the consequences of NAFTA having been, I think, over-argued, oversold, and over-feared, both by those that supported it, as I did, and those that opposed it when it came up to a vote. In my judgment, it is still really premature to reach a judgment about the success or not of NAFTA. There have been very exaggerated allegations made about job losses attributable to NAFTA that I think do not at all bear up under any kind of fair examination, but they have served to dominate a lot of the debate over the fast-track legislation. Likewise, people rightly complain about the awful state of environmental compliance and degradation along the Mexican border, and the awful state of worker compensation and worker rights in Mexico. The problem is getting from that observation to any kind of cause and effect argument that can be traced to NAFTA.
Well, would you agree, though, that there at least has been a negative impact as a result of NAFTA, and that the scale of that is really what's in dispute?
No, I would not agree to that.
No. Okay, you would argue that there's been positive benefits.
There's been a modest positive benefit. If you look at what happened, the most telling factoid in this, and again, I realize that people of goodwill can disagree, but the most telling piece of information is that while the net exports from countries other than the United States and Canada decreased markedly to Mexico during the recent downturn in the Mexican economy, U.S. exports decreased by a fraction of the experience that other nations had, and I think that is largely attributable to the fact that we had a preferential trade arrangement with Mexico that was a benefit. That is, it made the impact on U.S. exports to Mexico much less severe than it otherwise would have been.
Well, what would you attribute this contentiousness to, if not a real experience of the American people, to negative effects from NAFTA? I mean, why are people so hostile
I think, that has to do with sort of the phenomenology of the benefits of increased trade being generally diffuse and hard to attribute in a given consumer or worker's experience to a particular trade deal, whereas the costs and the injuries are very poignantly identified to particular workers that are dislocated as the result of changes, part of which are due to trading patterns. So, the fact that an American consumer is advantaged by a lower price for a particular product or lower inflation because of a more competitive environment doesn't occur to very many people to be traceable to trade arrangements, whereas the fact that a particular plant may be adversely affected by a relocation of that particular manufacturing activity somewhere else is very dramatic and much easier to point to and be angry about.
Well, okay. I mean, that makes sense, I think, on sort of an average person on the street level, but clearly there's elevated opposition from very organized and very informed sectors as well. The labor movement, environmental movement, these are people who are not naive about the realities and are weighing them and still feel that it's been negative.
I have yet to have anybody present again, a cause and effect explanation that NAFTA has made the environmental situation along the border worse than it otherwise would have been, given the fact that we already had an arrangement with Mexico that was very permissive with respect to Mexican exports into the United States. And so the conditions already existed before NAFTA for firms that wished to take advantage of whatever, whether it's lower wage rates or whatever, in Mexico, to do so. The effect of NAFTA, which I think is reflected in that trade experience we had during the peso crisis, was to a great extent to even that imbalance so that U.S. exports into Mexico started to receive something along the same favorable lines, same kind of treatment going into Mexico as Mexican exports in the United States.
But it it's
And
still.
I don't understand how that makes the Mexican environment worse.
Well, it strikes me though that if there is the appearance of a problem, why not take the opposite tack on the problem and instead of liberalizing all of these rules, approach them more conservatively so that we can try and get a handle on these environmental problems?
Well, in fact, I think that's what is implicit in the approach that I have taken. I realize that it's not interpreted that way by those that disagree with me. My belief is that the greatest contribution we can make to improved environmental standards or improved wage standards in other countries is to do what we can without shorting our own economy to improve theirs. That trade isn't a zero-sum game in which there have to be losers to offset winners, that everybody can be better off. I have started, and it may be a little bit of an awkward way of putting the argument, but let's just suppose that we had a trade negotiation going on between the United States of America in 1997, and our negotiating partner wasn't Mexico or Chile or, pick a country, but it was the United States of 1950 or 1947, to make it an even 50 years ago. If we had attempted in that negotiation to insist that that United States adhere to the current United States set of environmental standards, the negotiation would go nowhere, because that country wasn't yet in a position, either through its knowledge, state of the economy, whatever it may have been, to accept necessarily our understanding of what the best way to manage the environmental dimensions of an economy was going to be.
But if market forces are driving all of this, and
But I mean, just let me finish the point, which is just about two more sentences. The reality is that there are lots of countries around the world that aren't even where we were 50 years ago.
right.
And we need to be realistic about the extent to which we can use market opening trade negotiations as a hook for insisting on any particular environmental standards in those countries.
Okay, I'm not following you. The last sentence.
Well, what I'm trying to say is the main thrust of these trade talks that would have been authorized under fast track or occurred in concluding NAFTA is to enable U.S. products to get into foreign markets, or U.S. services to get into foreign markets. The nature of those discussions really don't lend themselves to our also insisting as a condition on our getting into the markets of country X, that country X also do us the favor of adjusting their environmental and labor standards to meet ours. It doesn't work that way.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but the flip side of it is that we're offering them access to our market. And why can't we set whatever conditions that we want as a democratic society?
Well, we certainly can, and we do, but the reality also is that we are typically already in a concessionary position. We're the most open economy in the world already. What we're trying to do is to get something like the kind of access into a lot of more closed markets that we already permit without even getting into these negotiations to most of the rest of the world. So the thing that I think is unstated in the argument of most of the people opposed to, in this case, fast-track trading authority, may be that we need, in fact, to raise tariff barriers or other barriers for access in the United States. I wish, if that's what they believe, that they said it in so many words, because then we can be engaged on the real question of whether this country would be better off with greater protections against international trade than we now have. I don't think we would, and in fact I think if we started to go in that direction, it would really precipitate a very unconstructive retrenchment in international trade throughout the entire trading community that would hurt everybody.
But, okay, so you're suggesting that we could do that if we want to, but you don't think it would be a good idea?
No, I don't think that the U.S. standard of living, nor job security, nor international environmental nor economic standards would improve if we did that. In fact, I think they would go the other way. And I think the vast majority of economists would support that analysis.
Well, that part may be true, but I'm not sure I necessarily believe it. Because if
Well, and that's your privilege too.
For example, though, I mean, if we made environmental and labor standards a condition of someone exporting from their country into our country, wouldn't that in and of itself have a positive effect on environmental conditions and labor standards in that country?
To the extent that it was worth it to that country to make those changes and that it was within their economic capability to make those changes. We have no guarantee that it would be. That gets back to my somewhat strained suggestion that we think of what the post-war United States would have been able to do if it were in this kind of negotiation with the current United States. And obviously there are lots of countries around the world that aren't as well off in 1997 as the United States was in 1947 and are in no better position today than we were then to have made a leap to those kinds of standards, and the alternative would have been a great retrenchment in international trading. Again, I think to the ultimate harm of the entire international community.
Well, I understand, but it occurs to me that one of the spin-off effects of this kind of approach that I'm suggesting might be to discourage factory relocation from the United States to Mexico. If a factory, if Chrysler, for example, had to pay higher wages and observe higher environmental standards in Mexico, they might be more willing to keep the factory that they're closing now in St. Louis, for example. In which case, all of those people who work in St. Louis would still have jobs, and whereas now they're,
well,
they
I
don't.
guess, part of the response to that is we now have more auto workers at work in this country than we did before NAFTA. Wages are up. Unemployment is down. Yes, there have been some relocations, but net overall, we have more people making more cars in the United States than we did before NAFTA.
But and obviously the debate would hinge on whether that's true in general with industrial jobs, not with one particular segment of the market.
Well, and the question also in my mind, if you want to talk autos, let's talk autos. If you want to talk something else, I may or may not know anything about it. But it was, really interesting to me that at the same time all this was going on with NAFTA, that both Mercedes-Benz and BMW chose to locate their new North American manufacturing facilities, which they were starting from scratch in the mid-90s, as I recall, in the United States rather than in Mexico. Why do you suppose they did that?
Well, I think the more salient point is that they chose the United States rather than Germany.
Well, but, with NAFTA, the tariff barrier as between the two countries was coming down to a negligible level. Why if we didn't continue to have competitive advantages even in heavy manufacturing in this country, would they have located here? I mean, the point is there's a lot more to all of these decisions than just what the wage levels happen to be in a country and what the environmental requirements happen to be, as important as those things are.
Well, I mean, that's certainly true, but Mercedes-Benz chose Alabama as opposed to choosing Michigan. And
well,
I
are
think
you
that
suggesting
clearly
then that we should have tariff barriers between the states in order to deal with all of that?
Well, I guess I would suggest we need a higher federaal minimum wage in all of
agree.
the states. Okay. We do have a couple callers lined up already, so let's start with Dennis. Dennis, are you with us?
Hello, I'm here.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Dennis DeMaio, and I'm a union official. And first of all, wanted to call to register my disgust and displeasure at Congressman Skaggs for stabbing us in the back on this fast-track legislation. I remember Congressman Skaggs personally talking to you when you came down to the Labor Day parade in Denver, and it's very remarkable that within a matter of days, after coming down and shaking hands with us officials at the Labor Day parade in Denver, you turned around and stabbed us in the back, and you didn't tell us, you didn't have the decency to tell us when you showed up to have photo opportunities at the Labor Day parade that you were going to turn around and engage and be a participant in the most harmful treaty this century for workers, certainly, in terms of NAFTA and extending NAFTA to the Hemispheres. On the one hand, you say that you want the U.S. to take a leadership role on trade. Well, I suggest to you, Congressman, that a leadership role really means elevating labor standards and elevating environmental standards and not bringing the bar down, as you know very well is going to be done with fast track being extending NAFTA throughout the hemisphere. We need to elevate these standards, not bring it down. And if you really believe what you say about taking a leadership role in this, it really boils down to making labor standards and making environmental standards a part of the agreement, not toothless side agreements that happen under NAFTA. I had faxed to your office after we had met some information regarding the toothless side agreement on labor, and I don't know what was ever done with that information, but between the time that it was faxed to you, you had made a decision, that you were going to ignore that and other information that has been sent to you by labor officials, by citizens, by workers, and you have agreed to engage, and support a treaty which I suggest and I propose is the most anti-worker treaty that has ever been concocted in this century. And if I could, just rephrase an old Elvis Presley thing, you ain't nothing but a corporate hound dog, and you ain't no friend of mine. And I think, in terms of labor, I think we have two kinds of issues. One's a short term and one's a long term. In the short term, we will continue to use the resources that are available to labor to point out the inconsistencies in your record and other records of other Democratic Party officials and other, certainly Republicans, who engage in anti-worker legislation. And that's the short term. And in the long term, a lot of us are convinced that the Democratic Party has abandoned its roots to working people, and we feel it necessary and have, in fact, created a Labor Party, which was formed in June of 1996 in Cleveland. And although we're not running candidates now, this is certainly a long-term solution for labor and working people in this country. And I think you're kind of, with all due respect, Congressman, part and parcel of the problems within the Democratic Party. Now, when President Clinton was proposed, when the striker replacement bill was put before him, he didn't use a dime, he didn't use any muscle, he didn't use anything to try to twist arms to support the striker replacement bill to ban permanent replacements for striking workers. And you and a lot of other Democrats did nothing, to push that legislation through. But yet when anti-worker legislation comes through, like NAFTA, an extension of NAFTA, you folks all jump on board.
Okay, Dennis. Let's give the congressman a chance to respond to all of that. Thank you very much. Go ahead,
That doesn't sound like very much respect is due in the usual phrase of all due respect, which usually precedes a comment from somebody that doesn't have much, and that comes with the territory. I just wish Mr. DeMaio had some of his facts straight, but let's begin with my lifetime rating by the National AFL-CIO on labor issues, which is higher than any other member of the Colorado congressional delegation, something I'm quite proud of and make no apology for at all, but seems to be ignored by union members on some occasions such as this, when one issue, which is of great significance, seems to take precedence over all others. But I think it's legitimate to point out that one of the reasons I was invited by the leadership of the state and Denver Area Labor Federation to the Labor Day Parade was my long-standing good record on labor issues, including having been a co-sponsor, evidently forgotten by Mr. DeMaio, of the striker replacement legislation. And as far as the president's record on that, my memory is that he issued an executive order prohibiting federal contracting with firms that did not pledge to adhere to a no-striker replacement policy. So again,
But he
the
didn't
facts
work
are
the phones. He didn't
the
establish
facts.
a J.J.
I listened through all of your statement. Let me finish mine, if I may.
Sure.
I think that's a significant and not exactly a retiring position that the president took on that particular issue. Finally, there was no treaty being voted on in the fast-track legislation. All that was involved in this was a grant of negotiating authority to the president to be able to, if he succeeds in a negotiation, to bring back for a further vote of the House and Senate any agreements that may be reached, at which time we can exercise our responsibility and judgment about the merits or demerits of any such treaties. So to suggest that the fast-track vote was itself a vote on a treaty that carried any particular negative implications for either labor rights or environmental standards is simply a misrepresentation.
Well, can I respond, or do you?
Well, you know, actually,
It's Richard's show,
we
so
do have
whatever
some.
you please,
we
Richard.
do have some calls backed up. So let me. I think we ought to move on to that. But thank you very much, Dennis.
Sure.
Although before we move on to the next one, Congressman, I did want to come back to this idea about the Democratic Party leaving its roots behind. Would you agree or not that it's fair criticism that with the rise to significant influence of the Democratic Leadership Council that the Democratic Party has moved to the right and therefore has moved away from its base?
I think it is a legitimate debate as to where the DLC is headed and how that compares or not with the traditional home base of the Democratic Party in working people and civil rights and basic justice and equity in this society. That has a set of, I'm not here to advocate for or be an apologist for the DLC, but that's sort of the stalking horse in this particular debate. I think the Democratic Party has evolved to a different position on a lot of fiscal issues in particular, and it is primarily on that front that I think it's, I don't know that we've left our base in that sense, but rather realized that if we're going to be able to responsibly address healthcare and education and social justice issues, it's only going to happen if we are able to get the basic financial standing of the country in better order than it was in a few years ago.
And well, let's try Julius this time.
Sometime making phone calls on behalf of the congressman, but I'm really disappointed about your stance on fast track. The main reason that I'm disappointed about that has to do with the treaty that it has been in the works for some time, which it is my belief and the belief of a lot of observers that the Clinton administration intends to use fast track to approve, and that is the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, otherwise known as MAI.
Right.
And as I'm sure you're aware, the treaty is very controversial, and among the reasons it is controversial is that it essentially gives away U.S. sovereignty. There's a portion in the treaty, Article 4, Section 1 of the draft, which states that it's essentially a takings clause, a global takings clause for corporations, where corporations who feel that their property rights in the United States or in any other country under MAI are being unreasonably reduced, the value of their property is being reduced by regulations in the United States or in another country, they may sue that country either to change the law or for the monetary damages to be compensated for that loss of property value. And the important thing here to remember is that these suits would not necessarily be heard in U.S. court, but could be heard in international tribunals, which would have authority over all U.S. law. And I find it amazing, frankly, that Mr. Skaggs, who was, I believe, former Marine and also fairly familiar with constitutional law, is willing to give away our sovereignty as a nation, essentially to multilateral or multinational corporations. And then I have a second point to make, just briefly. I'm interested that you said that fast track applies to treaties. That's my belief as well. However, if you look at the U.S. Constitution, it states that in Article 2, Section 2, treaties must be approved by 2/3 of the Senate. It's pretty clear in that. Fast track is clearly, under fast track, it says that you only need a majority of the House and Senate to pass a treaty, and that is clearly unconstitutional. So I'd like to hear your views on both of those things.
Okay.
Let me take them in order very quickly. One, it is absolutely clear to me that MAI is not subsumed or grandfathered under the fast-track legislation, which has not yet passed. But had we adopted it, it would not have included MAI. The reasons are, one, legal, and two, practical. On the legal side, the legislation would only grandfather into fast-track consideration any negotiation underway which had already included the full consultation requirements that would be imposed under the fast-track authority. MAI has not been subject to any of those consultation requirements, could not qualify for being grandfathered, therefore, under the fast-track bill had it been adopted, and therefore, if, and we have not yet, if the administration does sign off on MAI in whatever later draft might be concluded, that would be subject to regular implementing action by Congress with full right to amend it or to reject it, as the case might be. So it simply wasn't in the fast-track legislation, wasn't contemplated as being brought to Congress under fast-track authority, and I know that the position to the contrary is repeated over and over again. It's simply not true. The practical part of this is that this fast-track bill was going to be for essentially this administration, and the administration had gone on record, and I have writings signed by the U.S. Trade Representative that in addition to this legal disqualification for MAI, the administration taking the position as a practical political matter that it wasn't going to bring MAI to Congress under fast track. So that is simply off the table and not germane to the debate about fast track. On your second point, I don't believe I said fast track contemplated treaties. It contemplates trade agreements, which are a different animal.
You clearly said treaties several times.
Well, I was correcting Mr. DeMaio, who kept talking about my voting for a treaty. I wasn't voting for a treaty. I was voting for authority to negotiate agreements. And if I misspoke, let me correct it in responding to your second point.
Okay.
Because, indeed, treaties do require a two-thirds vote of the Senate. We have several court decisions and other legal authority that these trade agreements are not treaties and couldn't be taken under treaty authority because they typically affect the whole set of domestic laws that are affected by changes in trade laws, duty, tariff and duty statutes, among others, that have to be changed, if they're going to be, by passage of law that requires, as you also obviously know, action by both houses of Congress. And there is ample legal authority that the Constitution gives the President the responsibility to carry on the international affairs, the foreign affairs of the United States government under his powers under Article 2, and Congress has its legislative responsibilities under Article 1 to determine whether to enact enabling legislation, not treaties, to implement those trade agreements.
Unfortunately, Joyce, I think we need to move on, but
Okay,
thank you very much. David, I do have one...
7 minutes, and then I need to say good night, Richard.
I'm sorry?
I said I've got another 6 or 7 minutes, and then I will need to
Okay.
say good evening.
Real quick, I want to hit on the more philosophical point about MAI, which I don't think you addressed, but I think that's part of what's really bothering people is this sovereignty question, the idea that we would give up democratic power to a trade agreement of some sort.
Well, let me just say we give up, let me say something about MAI, which is basically that, if there were that kind of derogation of U.S. Ability to protect our own environmental interests, as was characterized by the prior caller, I don't see that getting my vote or being adopted in Congress, period. But the generic question of whether we enter into international agreements that have some effect on U.S. sovereignty is really a non-starter. It is almost by definition that any agreement involving our making legal and binding commitments to the rest of the international community involves some effect on U.S. sovereignty. Our decision as a nation and as a Congress has to be whether it is nonetheless a net benefit to the interests of the United States to do so, whether it's in trade, in which certainly trade agreements and our agreement to be bound, for instance, by certain determinations by the World Trade Organization nets a benefit to the United States. I think it clearly does. But this is no different than our agreeing to the Chemical Weapons Convention, in which we have given up some sovereignty in permitting inspection on the United States soil to determine our compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention, as other countries have, but we've done it because we think it makes for a better world and a better life for U.S. citizens to have made that concession in the cause of a greater benefit.
Okay, and I understand that point. We ought to rush along here and take a call from Beth.
Hello?
Hi.
Hi. I'm really happy to be speaking with you, representing Skaggs and the announcer. I've appreciated your letters, which I've also received recently in response to my concerns, Representative Skaggs, about this whole issue. And today there was also an NPR explanation of what Fast Track was about, and that's been also very helpful. One response that has come up for me is that some of us who actually believe in participatory representational republic did feel that, even if we were following things with NAFTA and GATT, we were almost purposefully and calculatingly left out of the loop. There wasn't much time given, and it was voted on, and we didn't even have a chance to see any documents or do much more than read summaries from other people before it was already passed. And I think that could explain why there's been sort of a waveform that's come back of returning awareness from people who are your constituents and other people, that there's a need to sort of have a little bit of time and response input and feedback into the process. And that's one comment, which is, I feel that people don't feel that they were heard months ago or a year or two ago, and there's still a little bit, there was a loss of trust.
I think that's a real legitimate criticism, both in the way, for instance, the run-up to this particular, what turned out to be a non-vote a few days ago, and I am critical of the way the President of the United States has handled this whole thing in not having legislation prepared very far ahead of time, which would have enabled all of us to have had a more considered opportunity to take a look at it in the degree to which he's engaged in explaining to the public generally what's going on and why it's important from his point of view. On the other side of the ledger, which hasn't gotten very much attention or credit, in part because it happened in such an accelerated way, is that the legislation that he did finally propose includes the most extensive requirements for prior involvement and consultation in any trade agreements that might have been negotiated under this fast-track legislation, including, for the first time, requirements of the creation of both labor and environmental consultative groups that would be required to be kept informed of all negotiations from inception to conclusion in an effort to get at what is a legitimate argument that these are things that ought to command a greater level of public information and participation than they typically have.
I think I had a few more points that were related to things you said, and that was sort of a fallout from, I think he's trying to pick up the ball from the concerns from NAFTA and GATT, and one of the things from your letter that you put out and also this evening is that the argument that we really can't require other countries, there's 4 points, and one of the arguments that you made was that we really can't require other countries to take on our environmental standards for various things. And I think one of our concerns is, yes, I'm very concerned about Mexican workers and workers in other countries. However, it has come to my attention from some of the materials that I've gotten from Friends Committee on Legislative Alert and things, relatively level-headed watchdogs, that there's been an increase in the amount of produce and food stuffs coming into the country that cannot be required to have non-pesticide residues because of the treaty, and that, in fact, we can't test for them because we don't have the personnel. And one of the things that, if I could just get through the fourth, is that I feel like because we've given corporations for the past 150 years increasing legal rights, it seems that it wouldn't be improper for us to require corporations, whether in other countries or in this country, simply to promote and keep standards for health in a preventive mode rather than in a let's catch this after it's already caused illness to children or whatever. It seems like preventive mode would be beneficial to our efforts to create a better health situation in both countries without compromising their sovereignty of another country. We're simply protecting the standards that we already have in place. You made the second point I wanted to make was that you did mention that we have the most open economy in the world already, and I can't verify that because I'm not in trade, but it did come to my attention that in some ways we have controlled other people's economies. For example, those of us who were familiar with the Nicaraguan situation, it seemed that mostly what they were saying is that they wanted an open economy. They wanted to be able to trade with anyone, whether it was Soviet or Swedish or American, and that our country went in and said, you can't do that, and created a war around that. That's point number 2. And in response to your let's make a treaty with the 1950s United States, there again, we were the preeminent physicists of the world, and I've just recently seen most of the Strategic Air Command's recently released declassified films of the over 1,000 nuclear tests that were performed on our soil and performed basically where we bombed the United States and the people of the United States over 1,000 times. And that was in 1950, 51, 52, 53, 54. And at that time, we did have the capability to muster enormous resources, and these are shown in the films, the enormous resources that were mustered to be able to perform these tests. And it seems that at that time we were operating from a position of fear that we needed to bomb our own people in order to bomb other people to protect our rights. And it seems that that argument got us a lot of illnesses. A lot of people in the state of Utah, a lot of women there have breast cancer. I don't know if you're familiar with Refuge, which is Terry Tempest Williams' book, where she describes her family as the clan of one-breasted women. 9 women in her family are dead or have had breast cancer as a result of these above-ground tests. So the argument that we cannot or should not stop things that are coming into our country because they're loaded with pesticide residues, because it would require the other country to up their standards, seems to be the kind of thinking that got us the breast cancer victims and the cancer
I need
victims.
to respond to that point, and then I'm going to have to say goodnight. And I do want to get to that point because there are really 2 pieces of that. One, there is nothing in NAFTA or other treaties that prevent us from insisting on any standard that is legitimately necessary to protect health and safety in this country. The problem may be, too, as your observations suggested, we do not have sufficient staff at the border to make sure that those standards are in fact being met. But there's nothing to prevent us from making sure that pesticide residues or anything else are eliminated or brought to levels that don't present a human health problem for American consumers. We need to beef up our ability to make sure that those standards are being met. I apologize for not being able to hear you out on point 4, but
I think I kind of mushed 2 of them
okay.
together. So that was
I'm due down at a meeting in Wheat Ridge in a very short order, and with the roads as bad as they are, I need to say thank you for the chance to be on the show, Richard, and I hope we can do it again.
Thank you very much,
Okay.
Congressman. Have
Bye.
a good evening. And thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
And with that, we're going to go to a little bit of a talk show format, and I'm going to go to Anand and for a little bit of comment.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to make a comment on free trade. For a long time, environmental economists have held that the price of oil, which is both literally and metaphorically fueling all this trade, is not a true price because we don't count the cost of its manufacture by natural processes, which probably took millions of years, which is a hidden subsidy. And they argue, and one can argue quite effectively, that this is what makes goods artificially cheaper, even if it requires that it be transported across huge distances. There are classic cases of timber going from the U.S. to Japan and toothpicks returning, on the same ship. And that if the oil price were a truer price, a lot of free trade would show a dramatic decrease in volume. And I just wanted David Skaggs' comment on that. I know he's not there, but that's the thing I wanted to say.
Well, that's a good point. Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
I want to extend an apology to Bob because I think I accidentally hung up on him there, but let's check in with Caroline.
Hi, my name's Carolyn, and I've been involved in the fight against the fast track. And I think one of the points that David Skaggs kept talking about was U.S. interests and American interests, and I think it's really important to recognize, and I think that this really was what showed up in the fight in Congress, is that there isn't a monolithic American interest. There's the interest of the corporations, and then there's the interest of working people and environmentalists. And I think it's really important when you hear somebody talking about U.S. interests to recognize that there is definitely a class system in our country, and that it's important to ask whose interests are you talking about. And I would challenge David Skaggs in terms of saying that free trade is in the American interest the way that it's set up at this point, and that taking out all labor standards and environmental standards is in the interest of most of the people in this country. It may, in fact it is, in the interest of the corporations, because if you take out the environmental and labor standards, they can make a lot more money. And they can pay people starvation wages and they can decimate the environment in another country. But I think whenever he was talking about U.S. interests, really what he was talking about is the interests of multinational corporations.
Well, I have to say that I agree with that particular analysis. And you know, while I have you on the phone and we have a couple of minutes, Carolyn, I'd like to get your opinion and also callers, if other people, if they want to call in. Do you think that the Democratic Party has been abandoning its base and that something dramatic is going to have to shake out of all that in American politics?
I think they have, and I think probably the Democratic Leadership Council is the group that's gone most to the right, and obviously, you know, they've accepted corporate money now to a much larger extent than they did in the 1970s. Since the 1970s, they've been moving much more in the direction of funding themselves through major corporate interests. But I think that the fight that just happened in Congress around fast track shows that the grassroots can still influence the Democratic Party, because this really was a victory for the environmental movement, the peace movement, the justice movement, and the labor movement. And the majority of Democrats didn't buckle under to the president. I mean, that's a major victory. So,
okay. I have a couple other callers here, so let's take them real quick. Thank you. And we'll check in with Howard.
Yeah, I just had a quick comment. The congressman said in discussing whether this was a treaty or an agreement that this was an agreement. And I've been to the website of the OECD. I think it's in Paris, and they brag about the fact that this MAI thing is an open-ended treaty which is being worked on by the 29 nations of OECD, and then after it's passed would be open to other nations to join. So they make a very specific point that this is a treaty, not an agreement.
And that was an English language website?
Yes, it is, and it's on the web.
Well, do you remember the
I don't
URL?
have the address, but if you use a search engine and look for OECD, I believe it was something like a ministerial statement. I think you'll find it quite easily.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Sure.
And let's check in with Andrew.
Hello.
Andrew.
I couldn't get on earlier, but I was burning with a question for David Skaggs, and I thought maybe I should just ask the open-ended question, especially if he ever comes on your show again. He made the point that NAFTA was to improve working standards in Mexico and across the world and improve their standards in general. But then he proceeded to say it wasn't our place to put any standards upon them. And I was just dying to ask him how we were going to help their environmental standards and their work standards without raising them at all. It just seems preposterous to make that type of statement, but yet that seemed to be exactly what he said.
Yeah, that is the free market argument, isn't it? That the free market will bring those things up as it has here, although that more and more seems questionable. But then when you look around, it seems that the market actually seems to bring things down.
Yes,
and
with a very anti-labor, anti-environmental type policies that the Mexican government has, how can you? It just doesn't work for me. And I also had wanted to ask him the question that one of your previous callers essentially said right after he got off is it's obvious who NAFTA has cost in the U.S., the labor, the working class, but who has it not, or who has it helped, you know, and are those jobs really replaced by cheap labor and the lowering of prices of goods? I don't think that's a really good argument. But anyway, that's all I had to say.
Well, let me just ask you a quick question, the question I asked Carolyn a little earlier. Do you think that the Democratic Party over the last 20 years has abandoned its base and that something significant will have to shake out of American politics as a result? Oh, so you're already part of that alternative.
Yes, I'm already part of the alternative, pushing as hard as I can. To me, it seems like the Democrats have tried to play the game and beat the Republicans at raising money, but due to the fact that they will always be seen as being left of the Republicans, they're going to lose. They can't raise as much money as the Republicans can, and it looks to me like they will suffer a slow death. Unfortunately, it's going to be slow, and we're going to have to hold on for a long time.
Okay, well, thank you very much for calling. And with that, I'll thank you listeners for joining us this evening on Hemispheres, a regular feature of Tuesday evening, 6 to 7 on KGNU. This is KGNU Boulder, and coming up next we have Corriente.